Some of these iron nails have been trapped inside wet wood for over 500 years, and they're still holding. Not polished, not protected, just there. That shouldn't happen. Because iron is usually the first thing to fail. It rusts, expands, breaks the wood around it from the inside. That's what we expect. That's what modern iron does. And yet, in old churches, doors, and beams that have soaked through centuries of rain and cold, the nails are still intact. Meanwhile, newer metal fails in decades, which is where things start to feel wrong. You can see them if you look closely. Old oak doors, warped and scarred, covered in uneven hand-forged nails. None of them perfect. Some bent, some darkened almost black. They look weaker than anything we'd use today, and yet they outlast it. It seems like the environment should have destroyed them. The wood expands, contracts, breathes with moisture year after year. That constant pressure alone should crack the iron apart from within. But it doesn't. Not always. In some cases, the wood around the nail turns darker, harder, almost sealed, as if instead of breaking the structure, the iron and wood slowly adapted to each other. Which is strange, because we don't design materials that way anymore. And the more you look at it, the less it feels like luck. Because these nails weren't just made, they were shaped slowly by hand. Hammered again and again while hot, changing something inside the metal we don't usually think about. Not enough to explain everything, but enough to make you pause. Because if rough, uneven iron can survive longer than modern steel in the same conditions, then maybe durability isn't just about strength. Maybe it's about something we stopped paying attention to, and that raises a deeper question. What exactly were these nails doing differently once they were inside the wood? But here's where it starts to break apart. Because when people began replacing those old nails, the results didn't improve. They got worse. In restoration projects, modern iron and even steel nails were driven into the same kinds of beams. Same oak, same moisture, same environment. Everything should have worked better. Stronger metal, cleaner production, more consistent structure. And yet, within years, sometimes just decades, those newer nails began to fail, faster than the ones they replaced. Which doesn't make sense, because modern steel is supposed to be superior. It's refined, controlled, engineered, down to the microscopic level. There are entire industries built around making sure it performs predictably. And yet, in these old wooden structures, predictability seems to be the problem. Some of the newer nails don't just rust, they swell. They push outward. They split the wood that had been stable for centuries. You start seeing cracks forming from the inside, lines spreading slowly along the grain. The failure isn't quiet, it's aggressive. And that's the contradiction. Because the older nails, the rough ones, don't always do that. Even when they corrode, it feels slower, more contained, almost as if the process settles instead of escalating, which is hard to explain, because corrosion is corrosion, isn't it? Iron reacts with moisture and oxygen. That part hasn't changed in 1,000 years. The chemistry should be the same, and yet the behavior isn't. There are cases where black staining forms around the old nails, a reaction between the iron and the tannins in the wood. It looks like damage at first, like something is going wrong. But sometimes, that darkened area becomes denser, harder, less vulnerable to further decay, almost like a boundary, which raises an uncomfortable thought. What if some forms of corrosion weren't entirely destructive? What if, under certain conditions, they actually slowed things down? That idea doesn't sit well with modern logic. We treat rust as failure, something to prevent, eliminate, coat over, isolate completely. But here, it doesn't behave like a simple enemy. It behaves differently. And then there's another detail people tend to overlook. The old nails were rarely uniform, each one slightly different. Different carbon content, different internal structure depending on how it was heated, hammered, cooled. In modern production, that kind of inconsistency would be considered a flaw. But what if, in this case, it wasn't? Because uniform materials fail in uniform ways. They reach a threshold, and then they give in, all at once, predictably. But these older nails don't seem to follow a single pattern. Some corrode faster, some slower. Some interact with the wood differently. The system as a whole becomes less predictable. And maybe that's exactly why it lasts. Not because it's perfect, but because it isn't. Which leads to a strange conclusion. Maybe the medieval builders weren't working with stronger materials. Maybe they were working with materials that behaved in ways we've learned to eliminate. And if that's true, then the real question isn't why those nails survived. It's why our versions don't. And this is the part we usually miss, because we assume knowledge lives in books. But for most of history, it lived in hands. A blacksmith didn't calculate carbon percentages. He watched color, the way the metal glowed just before it softened, the sound it made under the hammer, the resistance when it was almost right. It seems imprecise, but it wasn't random. Over years, decades, patterns settled in. Not written, not measured, just repeated. Passed quietly from one set of hands to another, which is where things start to shift. Because a medieval nail wasn't just produced, it was worked, heated unevenly, hammered from different angles, folded, stretched, compressed again, every strike slightly altering the internal structure in ways no one fully described, but someone clearly noticed. And maybe that's the point. They didn't need to explain it. They only needed to see what lasted. There are records of old buildings where certain batches of nails held better than others, not because they came from better ore necessarily, but because they were made by a particular smith, a particular workshop, a particular rhythm of work. Which is strange, because that suggests durability wasn't just in the material, it was in the process, in the behavior of the person shaping it. And that idea doesn't fit well with how we think today. We separate design from making. Engineers plan, machines execute. Consistency is the goal. Remove variation. Eliminate human influence, because variation is risk. And yet, in those older systems, variation might have been the advantage. Because when a material isn't uniform, it doesn't fail all at once. It adapts unevenly, slowly, quietly. One part compensates for another, almost like a living system. Which sounds exaggerated until you look back at those structures still standing, still holding, still carrying weight through nails that were never identical. And then there's the wood. Builders didn't just choose timber randomly. They knew which trees grew slower, which ones resisted rot, which ones darkened around iron instead of breaking apart. Oak, chestnut, woods rich in tannins that react with metal in ways that don't fully reveal themselves at first. Again, no formal explanation, just observation. If it lasts, use it again. Simple. But over centuries, that kind of thinking builds something deeper than theory. It builds instinct. And instinct doesn't always survive industrialization. Because once you scale production, you stop listening to small differences. You standardize. You optimize for speed, cost, output. You remove the irregularities that don't make sense on paper. And maybe, without realizing it, you remove the very conditions that allowed these materials to cooperate in the first place. Not intentionally, just gradually. Which leaves us with something uncomfortable. Because when we look at those old nails, still holding inside wood that has lived through more than we can easily imagine, we're not just seeing a better material. We might be seeing the residue of a way of working that didn't try to control everything, only enough to make it last. And that leads to a final thought that's hard to ignore. If knowledge once lived in hands, what exactly did we lose when those hands were no longer needed? And maybe that loss didn't look like a mistake at first. It looked like progress. Stronger steel, faster production, perfect consistency. Materials that behave exactly the way we expect them to, every single time. No surprises, no irregularities, no dependence on the person holding the hammer. Which sounds like an improvement, until you place it back inside those old wooden structures. Because that's where the difference shows up. Modern nails don't ease into the system. They resist it. They hold tight until they don't. And when they fail cleanly, predictably, sometimes suddenly. But those older nails, they don't just hold. They age with the wood, slowly, unevenly, imperfectly. And that imperfection seems to absorb stress instead of amplifying it. Small changes spread out over time instead of building toward a single breaking point. Which is strange, because we usually associate imperfection with weakness. But here, it behaves more like resilience. And that leads to a trade-off we don't often talk about. Because modern systems are designed to be efficient. Old systems were designed to endure. Not perfectly, just long enough. Long enough to settle into their environment. Long enough to adjust to it. Long enough to become part of it instead of fighting it. And maybe that's the difference. We build things now to perform. They built things to last. Short sentence. And the cost of that shift is subtle. You don't see it in the first year or the 10th, but give it a century, and the pattern starts to emerge. Structures that rely on precision begin to depend on maintenance, on replacement, on constant intervention to keep everything within expected limits. While older structures sometimes continue quietly with less control, but more tolerance, more room for imperfection, more room for time, which leaves us here, looking at a piece of iron that should have disappeared centuries ago, still holding. Not because it was perfect, but because it was allowed to be something else. And maybe that's the part that doesn't quite sit right. Because if durability once came from working with materials instead of forcing them into exact behavior, then the question isn't just what we've improved. It's what we've traded away to get there.